I'm Analia Simon reporting for the NB Media Co-op at St. Thomas University. Just a few minutes ago, Neve delivered a lecture here. He's a leading human rights advocate and international human rights lawyer.
It is time to fully and completely give human rights their turn, above all by acknowledging our history of genocide of Indigenous peoples in Canada and committing to genuine reconciliation. It certainly means ending blatant double standards in our human rights diplomacy, such as our divergent and imbalanced approach over the decades to the Israel-Palestine conflict, and our total silence these days, no matter how low Donald Trump goes with his dismantling of the global human rights regime.
We'll go to his full talk in a moment. But first, here are the reactions of some of the people who showed up for the talk. Stay tuned.
I'm a student at UMB Law in my second year.
What did you think of the talk today?
It was a wonderful talk. One of the points that stuck out to me was how international law, and especially human rights, it boils down to what we can do in our everyday lives. And that can be an impact that transcends from the local all the way to the international on problems that we can all support and get behind. And one of the most important things that the lecturer said was how important it is to protect those who defend that principle itself. So I thought that was a good take-home message for anyone who could hear that.
I am a student. I'm a second-year student from Afghanistan. I do honor in economics, but more in the side of like how political economy could impact on women's and children's rights. And then I do a major in women's study and gender study.
What did you think of the talk today?
Honestly, the talk was fine. I do like how the points brought up about the universal right, human rights, and then how it's applied in the current situation of what's going on in the world and in the different countries. I really like that part of it. But the point was that when I usually listen to this type of talks or lectures, I really wanted to hear that how much this universal right that we are talking about apply for each countries and each individual. Usually I find it that is not applying in certain countries because universal rights being made based on certain countries that already had a base, but not for certain countries that are still developing, and it's not applying. And in that case, I always like being disagree with the structure of that, how this universal human rights applies in certain countries. And as a young generation, that I'm super frustrated and disappointed in certain applications of this rights. I want to change, and I change that structural from the base, because building over base and a base, it will never gonna happen. So far it didn't happen, and it will never gonna happen.
I'm a human rights student at STU, working in human rights criminology and Spanish and Latin American studies. So we do a lot of theory and a lot of work into this field. But it's so interesting hearing from someone who is able to give so much insight into the real frontline practice. And especially where I'm interning for the New Brunswick Human Rights Commission here in Fredericton, and most of my work so far has been about researching past human rights defenders in New Brunswick. And a big insight that I've found is that it really is about the small-scale change, and to hear Alex speak so highly about the individual action, the small changes and small corners, and really emphasize that through storytelling and through just his experiences is so interesting. And I think, at the fireside chat he had this morning, he emphasized the power of storytelling as a human rights tool. And to see it in practice and just realize, wow, it is one of the most powerful things that we have. It was so inspiring, and it makes my work in such a small corner of the world feel so much more important and valuable.
What did you think of the talk today?
I think whenever times are bleak and the world feels dark, you can go to an Neve talk and find a glimmer of hope, and I think that's what we got. So I feel inspired, and I know a lot of folks in the room, I'm sure, felt the same way. There's a lot coming at us every single day, and it's nice to be reminded that we're all in this together, and that we just need to find the strength and the solidarity with each other to be able to to move this fight forward. So I have the privilege of working with a migrant justice clinic here in New Brunswick, and we support migrant workers and people with the precarious immigration status here in New Brunswick, and we use the tools of human rights every day in our work to try and make sure that folks who are coming through our province, who are just trying to build a better life, and who are being victimized by a system of immigration rules and laws that make life hard for them at every turn, have some avenue to be able to live a life with some dignity, despite all of these forces working against them. And sometimes that can bring us down when we see when folks who come to us for help, we see the cases where they are unsuccessful, and that can bring us down. But it's important to hold on to the fact that there are victories that we can win, that we do win, and I think that's what I got from this talk, is that for every setback that we feel as a society, there are so many victories that we can celebrate together, to not lose hope. Because it's Jesse Jackson, Reverend Jesse Jackson, just died. It was in the news today, I think, who I think gave us many words to live by. One of which was, we must keep hope alive. And I think if there's no hope, then what else is there? So I think that's what I got from the talk today.
It is wonderful. Anytime I have the opportunity to be here in New Brunswick and speak to audiences, and given my gig, it's almost always about something in the human rights realm. It's so rich and meaningful to me, because it does have that sense of coming home, and there's no doubt that given that such a significant part of my formative years were in this province, my own human rights journey is very much one that, whether or not it begins in New Brunswick, very much goes through this wonderful province. And what a time to be gathering, to be reflecting upon the state of human rights in our world. Probably one or two of you noticed that it's not necessarily going all that well these days. And so there's, I think, a lot for us to reflect upon this evening, and certainly to have a conversation. And I really look forward to that part of the evening when I'll get to hear from you and hear your questions and what's on your mind. So as you've been sort of forewarned, I'm playing off the theme of what I did explore in 5 separate lectures across Canada last fall in the Massey Lectures. And the title of the book and of the lectures, Universal, Renewing Human Rights in a Fractured World. And I want to begin, therefore, with the first word, universal. And I'm a lawyer, and us lawyers every once in a while like to speak a wee bit of Latin. So it comes from the Latin, universus, meaning altogether, whole, or entire. And it is a word, it is an idea that is all-encompassing for everyone, everywhere. And at times, it shouts with passion and confidence. You can hear that, I'm sure. For when universal is on full display, it is truly nothing short of magnificent. In other moments, it speaks tentatively with anxious hesitation, for there its full extent eludes us. And when we are honest, as we must be, we have to acknowledge that universality is far too often deliberately betrayed. We certainly live in a time of what feels to be unprecedented global turmoil, hate, and division. Truth is under siege, and disinformation is on the rise. Legal and democratic norms and institutions are under attack. On a rapidly warming planet, we face the gravest ever threat to our well-being and even our very survival. The inherent sacredness of human life is aggressively contested from countless directions. This is not universality's finest hour, but it can be. In the raw aftermath of the Second World War and the Holocaust, as governments elaborated the world's first global human rights promises, this is the word they chose. In 1948, they proclaimed the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And universal was a very unconventional title for an international legal instrument. But the drafters of the Declaration and the governments that voted to adopt it knew what they were doing, and they were saying to us, this is for all of us. Well, in 2026, closing in on 80 years later, the word still packs a powerful punch, but it also screams to us of our profound failure to keep the promise. For we are far from a world in which human rights of all are universally acknowledged, let alone universally respected. What we confidently placed at the core of the promise, its universality, is above all else where we have fallen short. But even as a maelstrom of violence and hate and lies frays the fabric of universal human rights, billions of people continue to hold the promise close. They resist and organize precisely because the promise is universal. They do so even though the promise has been withheld from them. Here, universality is linked to courage and imagination. It is fueled by conviction and hard work, and it speaks truth that universally cannot be denied. This universality is nourished by solidarity. This universality rises above divisive lies and manufactured hate. This universality yearns to unite us in something hopeful and good. In early 2019, I was interviewing Rohingya refugees who had fled genocidal attacks in Myanmar and were now living in overcrowded and dangerous refugee camps in Bangladesh. I spent time with Mohammed Salim. He spoke to me of drowning. We drowned in waves of violence and hate spread by Facebook in Myanmar, he said. We nearly drowned as we made our way across the Neve River. Our boat had holes in it and the water was pouring in. We have nearly drowned many times here in the camp when the monsoons have brought rain and mud. Our desperate friends and family drown when they go out into the Bay of Bengal, hoping to make it somewhere safe, but their unsafe ships sink or are lost. Now they want to drown us by sending us to live in a prison camp for refugees out on a flooded sandbar island far out in the ocean. And we drown every day in the camp because we are locked up like criminals, don't have enough food, and our children are not allowed to go to school. We Rohingya are forgotten and left to drown. But when I learned about the Universal Declaration, he said, I knew that it holds promise as a lifeboat. I can assure you that the last thing I expected to see as I stooped to enter Mohammed's tiny, immaculate shelter in Jamtoli refugee camp was the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. But there it was, faded and curled at the edges, pinned up to the central post supporting the blue plastic sheeting that was home to Mohammed, his wife, their 4 young children, and his wife's elderly parents. Drowning is an apt metaphor for all that the Rohingya had been through, drowning literally while crossing rivers or taking to the high seas to reach safety, or when faced with the wrath of monsoon rains and flooding. Drowning figuratively under waves of violence and hate in person and online, and a punitive existence in the refugee camps. Drowning with no end in sight. As they fled the genocidal explosion of violence in Myanmar in 2017, Mohammed had watched as a beloved uncle was shot and killed in front of him. And at that time, the world was moved by the ferocious attacks and indescribable suffering inflicted upon the Rohingya. But with a global shrug of indifference, their plight seems forgotten now. Mohammed's family, simply 8 more among 1 million refugees crammed into camps with no prospect of returning home. But what was so compelling about that conversation with Mohammed is that it ended not in hopelessness, but with hope. For he saw hope promised in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, a lifeboat for humanity. Yet the world has not ensured that the lifeboat will be seaworthy. Mohammed's experience speaks to so many of our world's ongoing ruptures, mass atrocities and repression, the climate crisis, hate and polarization, economic deprivation, the reach of social media, and the immense scale of forced displacement. These crises are not only urgent, they are existential. They go deep into the heart of how we live our lives, how we view one another, and how we relate to the very natural world on which our existence depends. It is all the more daunting, given that the rules-based legal frameworks we have counted on to bring some degree of order to our world are collapsing. The United Nations is more deadlocked than ever under the Security Council's dysfunctional watch, enabled by the disgraceful veto power wielded by 3 of the 5 permanent members, the United States, Russia, and China, without the slightest concern for law, morality, or just plain human decency. Under their watch, genocide has marched on in Gaza, where the humanity of Palestinians is denied and their plight now left in the hands of Donald Trump's Board of Peace. The blatantly unlawful invasion of Ukraine is never taken up, not one single resolution. The unilateral and illegal US armed incursion into Venezuela, nothing. The massacre of thousands of protesters on the streets of Iran, again, nothing. And while wrenching crises in Sudan, Afghanistan, and Myanmar deepen, so too do the excuses for and thus normalization of inaction. Disavowal of international law abounds. Authoritarian leaders are winning elections. And there is even frequent dinner table and street corner talk of rising fascism, including at the White House. Awash in a sea of disinformation and the rapid demise of truth, we are certainly left with an increasingly wobbly tiller in our lifeboat, held together with rubber bands and duct tape with which to navigate these turbulent waters. But we do nevertheless have that lifeboat. And no matter how leaky or wobbly, Mohammed Salim and millions upon millions of people everywhere are intent on steering it to safe harbor. And so must we. Our world is indeed fractured in many, many ways. Fractures that have ruptured the human rights of billions of people through the global climate emergency, genocide and atrocities, repression, hate and authoritarianism, forced displacement and economic inequality, and the unrelenting march of technology into every corner of our lives. Fractures, though, that can be healed by a true embrace of the universal promise. Looking back, we are reminded of the essential beliefs and truths that lie behind the universal human rights promise, going back far millennia, in fact, long before the promise was in any way envisioned, let alone enshrined in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948. We see that in Indigenous teachings, religious and spiritual parables, the reflections of philosophers, and in the rallying cries of all of the momentous times of rebellion and revolution. Life is sacred. We are joined together in our common humanity. We all yearn for and deserve fairness and freedom. Powerfully captured in, amongst other ways, by the African concept of Ubuntu. I am because we are. Yet humanity's journey has also been marked by our unforgivable failure to acknowledge that universal human rights are inherent and they are inalienable, meaning we are all born with them. We don't need to do a single thing to earn them, and they can never be stripped away. Instead, human rights have become rather an exclusive club, steeped in white, moneyed, patriarchal privilege, while exclusion is rooted in sexism and misogyny, racism and intolerance, political domination, and economic exploitation. And though auxiliary membership has perhaps expanded from time to time, minimally and selectively, largely the clubhouse remains surrounded by fences of geopolitics, money, national security, intolerance, and just plain indifference, which at times seem unbreachable. Even with those high fences, however, the galvanizing power of people, be it one person acting courageously and defiantly, or millions of people mobilizing and resisting to make change happen in our world, perseveres and prevails. And this is such a time for that collectively, ultimately, invincible power to soar. And don't forget this, change always begins with just one person who demands that it be so. As was the case one day in October 2002, when a woman who introduced herself as Monia Mazig called the Amnesty International office, was put through to me, and I, remarkably, was at my desk and answered the phone. Her husband, Meher Arar, a Canadian citizen, had been arrested while changing planes in New York City on his way home to Ottawa from a family trip in Tunisia. Monia was concerned that he might be sent to Syria, where he had been born. And sure enough, after 2 weeks of unlawful detention in Brooklyn, Meher was indeed subject to extraordinary rendition, as we were starting to call it, to Syria by way of a CIA ghost plane, another term that was entering our lexicon. And there he endured a year of unlawful detention, torture, and other egregious human rights violations. Monia, meanwhile, mounted a truly heroic campaign to win her husband's freedom. It was a remarkable demonstration of courage at a time when simply wearing a hijab was a source of suspicion and recrimination. And many people shied away at first, not wanting to associate themselves with anything related to the United States and terrorism allegations. But Monia's persistence gained momentum, and Meher's plight eventually became one of the top political issues in the country. And finally, on October the 5th, 2003, he was released and returned home to his family. But it didn't end there. Meher and Monia now called for a public inquiry, stressing that accountability was crucial in order to ensure this would not happen again. And even though there was considerable public sympathy, it was a tall order to convince any government in those fraught years in the aftermath of 9/11 to subject its national security practices to that level of scrutiny. But to his credit, Prime Minister Paul Martin did take that step and convened a public inquiry. After 2 years of hearings, the presiding judge, Justice Dennis O'Connor, released 2 voluminous reports. He exonerated Meher, leading to an official apology and compensation from the federal government. Justice O'Connor also made recommendations for badly needed strengthening of the oversight of Canada's national security and law enforcement agencies. That, in turn, eventually led to creation of the National Security and Intelligence Committee of Parliamentarians and the National Security and Intelligence Review Agency. And just last year, legislation was passed to establish the Public Complaints and Review Commission to oversee the Canada Border Services Agency and the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. So why did I recount that history? Well, it does remind us, powerfully I would suggest, of the cost of selling human rights short to national security, but it also tells us the following. All of this enormous, consequential, legal, institutional change and reform, which will be with us for generations, occurred for one simple reason. Monia Mazig was determined to win her husband's freedom. Change begins with one person. Volker Turk, the current UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, has said to us, globally, that our world faces a stark choice between two paths. One of enlightened cooperation and solidarity, stable and seeking balance with our natural world. The other, unmistakably dystopian. Clearly, we seek that first path. But there's always been an excuse to wander off it, hasn't there been? Instead, markets, wars, geopolitics, and securitization rule. We, the idealists and dreamers, are told by the pragmatists and realists that this is how the problems of our world are solved. Yet that approach, I don't know if you have the same sense as I do, has failed colossally. And we are now not just looking down the dystopian path, we've started to move down that path. So what of the other path, the enlightened one? As my dear friend and colleague, Pam Palmater, a professor at Toronto Metropolitan University, a citizen of the Mi'kmaq Nation and a member of Eel River Bar First Nation, told my international human rights class at the University of Ottawa last year, imagine all the good we could do and the better country and world we would live in for Indigenous peoples and for all of humanity if we actually gave human rights their turn, just as we have always said we would. Indeed, it is time to fully and completely give human rights their turn. To do so means we have to begin by getting our own house in order. Above all, by acknowledging our history of genocide of Indigenous peoples in Canada and committing to genuine reconciliation. It certainly means ending blatant double standards in our human rights diplomacy, such as our divergent and imbalanced approach over the decades to the Israel-Palestine conflict, and our total silence these days, no matter how low Donald Trump goes with his dismantling of the global human rights regime. It means putting universal human rights at the heart of climate policy. Pipelines, anyone? And trade deals, such as, for instance, when chasing a new economic partnership with China, which leaves human rights completely out of the equation. It absolutely must mean demonstrating to Canadians and to the world that we are prepared to take our international human rights obligations seriously here, that we expect of ourselves nothing less than what we demand of the rest of the world. In fact, we must thoroughly reimagine the place of human rights in our communities, in our country, and in our world. It's a time for renewal, building on what we have created over the decades while reconceiving something different with a heightened sense of purpose. The universal human rights renewal that I imagine has 6 key elements to it. Put human rights first. Embrace universality and commit to equality. protect human rights defenders and the right to protest, ensure justice, be expansive, and believe in and champion human rights. It starts, number one, with putting human rights first. There's always an excuse for putting human rights on hold. One day, not now. There are other priorities. Oh, human rights, oh, there'll be a distraction. Oh, they're so expensive. Honestly, we just don't care. That anguish is captured in Omar El-Akkad's powerful book, One Day, Everyone Will Have Always Been Against This. In a cri de coeur and devastating critique of the world's failure to act to end genocide in Gaza, he writes, "When finally there is no other means of preserving self-interest but to act, the powerful will act. The same people who did the killing and financed the killing and justified the killing and turned away from the killing will congratulate themselves on doing the right thing. It is very important to do the right thing, eventually." Well, universal human rights were never intended to be left for that eventual one day. They were to be the starting point. That is why the Universal Declaration itself talks of human rights being the foundation of freedom, justice, and peace in the world. A solid foundation, not a leaky roof. Delaying human rights robs them of their purpose. Human rights do not rise to the top after a people have been decimated by genocide, are not something to think about after we are ravaged by the climate crisis, and do not come to the fore after economic policy and trade deals have gutted a community of their livelihood. So how about an international human rights action plan? We've actually never had one in Canada. Backed by an ambassador for human rights. Never had that either. To bring consistency and heft to our human rights diplomacy. Similarly, we need a nationwide framework for international human rights implementation on the home front. Never had that. Championed by ministers with explicit human rights mandates. Never had that. To ramp up domestic compliance with our country's international human rights obligations. Putting human rights first surely also requires a concerted effort to ratify all outstanding human rights treaties yet to be taken up by Canada, of which there are, you may be surprised to hear, far too many, which we have simply brushed off the table and said, we're not going there. Number two, embrace universality and commit to equality. When human rights are upheld for some people, but not everyone, in some places, not everywhere, and sometimes, not always, and when some rights matter and others simply do not, of course universality is nowhere to be found. At a time when equality rights are under withering attack from so many governments, including, of course, our very closest ally south of the border, Canada needs to offer substantial diplomatic, political, and financial support for, and I'm going to use these three words, diversity, equity, and inclusion around the world. As a hallmark of Canadian foreign policy, this is absolutely not the time to tiptoe around that vilified acronym, DEI, and it is certainly not the time to retreat from DEI programming. Advancing equality on the world stage must also be backed up by addressing inequality at home, and top of that list has to mean, at long last, full respect for the rights of Indigenous peoples. All jurisdictions should incorporate the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples into their laws. So far, that's only been done federally and in British Columbia and the Northwest Territories. And we must all embrace our shared personal responsibility. This is not just about governments. It's not just about Indigenous peoples. It's about every single one of us. How many of us have truly made our own reconciliation commitment. We all should. And so much more. It is obviously too late for last fall's budget. I made a request, seemed to have been overlooked, but federal funding for rights and equality needs to grow substantially. Just imagine, we use that word a lot in human rights activism, just imagine if we devoted even a minuscule fraction of the 5% of our GDP that is now to be steered towards the military to such initiatives. Just imagine the transformative change we could see. A particular shout out for refugees who are, despite the attitude of many governments, increasingly including our own, fully entitled to universal human rights. There's no opt-out just because you've had to flee your country and cross a border. Should we not, therefore, suspend the Canada-US Safe Third Country Agreement so that refugees who are demonstrably not safe in the United States, in fact, are more at risk with each Sharpie-declared executive order every single day? I can't imagine, I can't believe that we're having to have this conversation, are actually able to cross that border and access safety and human rights protection in Canada. I would say to all of you friends, the fact that we have not is frankly, at this moment in time, one of the most disgraceful elements of Canadian law and policy. Number 3, protect human rights defenders and the right to protest. To our collective shame, human rights defenders, who should be celebrated and revered, often pay with their lives simply for trying to make the universal human rights promise real. And that persecution has increasingly now started to become transnational, to cross borders, to reach far across the world with numerous governments, China, India, Iran, Saudi Arabia, Israel, and many others, targeting activists and journalists in other countries, including regularly in this country, in Canada. And when demonstrators take to the streets to defend human rights, governments of all stripes, be they repressive or democratic, seek to break protest movements, often with brutal force. My heart breaks when I think of the thousands of protesters killed in the streets of Iran in recent weeks. We need to recognize the essential role of human rights defenders and peaceful protest as sentinels of human rights protection and the lifeblood of democracy. And thus, defenders and protesters everywhere must be able to count on the Canadian government to have their back. And it's too bad I have to say this, we need a national action plan to protect human rights defenders in Canada as well, particularly Indigenous land defenders who increasingly, in many corners of the country, face criminalization for standing up for land, for standing up for territories, for standing up for the environment, and standing up for rights. What about maybe some nationwide guidelines for upholding the right to protest consistently across this country? Because we are far from having a consistent approach as to how police protest, be that rallies in front of Parliament, homelessness encampments in public parks, solidarity encampments on university campuses, or demonstrations that, yes, may block traffic at rush hour in city streets. The bottom line here is that no one ever should be killed, threatened, or silenced for defending human rights or for speaking out when they are violated. That must be universal. Number 4, ensure justice. Enforcement of the universal promise is nigh impossible if there is no effective remedy to turn to when rights are violated. It's common sense. There's so much to say here, but just think of this one example. Consider this. At the United Nations, Canada allows individuals to make complaints of their civil and political rights violations, but not of violations of their economic, social, and cultural rights. What that means is that I can pursue justice internationally against my government if I have been, if my rights to free expression or a fair trial have been violated. That matters. I'm all for that. But I can't do so if I have been denied access to my right to adequate housing or my right to safe water. Canada doesn't allow it. When it comes to justice, that guts the very heart out of universality. There has been some justice progress, uneven and tentative, in the drive to ensure that individuals who are responsible for mass atrocity crimes face justice. Genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity. Witness the growing and often controversial and difficult caseload of the International Criminal Court, for instance. Parallel to that, though, it's worth noting that Canada has not at all kept pace with other countries in ensuring that our own national courts are also playing their role in delivering that international justice. Compliance, remedies, and accountability are fundamental components of justice. And without justice, the universal human rights promise falters and really ultimately fails. We need to increase our support for the International Criminal Court, the establishment of which, I'm sure many of you are acutely aware of this. Canada wasn't just okay, we championed it, we led the way. And we certainly, therefore, should be pushing back now and certainly not remaining silent, as has been our recent tendency, when the court's personnel, including a Canadian judge, are subject to political attacks and sanctions emanating from south of the border. That should all be reinforced by increasing financial and political support for universal jurisdiction prosecutions in Canadian courts for individuals accused of atrocity crimes. There is so much, in fact, that we can do to ensure that human rights justice flourishes here at home. We could ratify the optional protocols, mini treaties, to the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights and the Convention on the Rights of the Child, so that individual complaints of rights violations under those two important treaties could be made to UN bodies. Curtailing or restricting resort to the notwithstanding clause in the Charter, increasingly used to deny human rights remedies and justice, not for the rich and powerful, but always, consistently, some of the most marginalized and vulnerable members of our communities. That's who we're taking justice away from. Any promise rises or falls on whether it is kept. Wishful thinking, as powerful as it can be, is not enough. When the universal human rights promise is broken, justice must be there to step in. Next, number 5, let's open things up. Be expansive. Stick with me for a minute on this, because you may all be thinking, what is he talking about? We're kind of, trying to hold on to what we've got, and he wants us to be expansive. Well, renewing human rights compels us to ensure the promise responds to needs that were not yet imagined when the Universal Declaration was written in 1948. For human rights, while universal, are not static. They're not frozen in time. They are multifaceted and dynamic. They must evolve as we evolve. They must maintain relevance, or the renewal will fall flat. By any measure, the overriding threat to human rights in our world is the spiraling global climate catastrophe, something that was not envisioned in the least in 1948. To ensure the planet does not die, people around the world are now recognizing nature's own rights. Here in Canada, the Magpie River in northern Quebec has been granted legal personhood, meaning it is not simply an object to exploit, but a person to be protected. That's happening around the world. In 2010, a People's Conference came together with delegates from around the world, and they adopted a universal declaration of the rights of Mother Earth. So yes, be expansive. That certainly must also extend to the distribution of wealth in our world. We need an economy that makes deliberate linkages to human rights in such areas as taxation, debt, public services, climate finance, international development assistance, and reparations for things like colonialism and slavery. And what of technology? The dizzying digital advances of the past decade have brought enormous human rights advantages. There's no question about that. But they also have caused and continue to cause staggering human rights harms. And of course, they have now become irreversibly embedded in our lives. The challenge, and I admit it is a considerable one, and this is not my wheelhouse, I'm not the expert, but we need to find the sweet spot that embraces the good and banishes the bad. And while I may not be that expert, the one thing I do know beyond any doubt is that leaving that in the hands of social media and technology billionaires has predictably been a colossal disaster. So yes, it is tempting to retreat to safeguarding existing rights frameworks that are under attack, and we do have to do that work. But we must find space and imagination to be expansive and ensure human rights are relevant to the challenges of today, including by evolving our understanding of human rights. Brings me to my last of my 6 points. I come to it last, but in many respects, I think it is likely more important than all else. It is simple, but it is so profoundly necessary, and it is that we must believe in and champion human rights. Eleanor Roosevelt was a formidable and passionate believer in and champion of universal human rights in those crucial early years of the United Nations, including chairing the first ever UN Commission on Human Rights and the drafting committee that prepared the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. At an event in 1958, so marking the 10th anniversary of the Declaration, she reflected on the meaning of universal human rights. And it's a beautiful speech, but I just want to share one sentence with you. Where, after all, do universal human rights begin? She asked. In small places, close to home, so close and so small that they cannot be seen on any map of the world. And I think we need to hold on to that, especially in this time, because indeed, universal is not just about the wide sweep and grandiosity of the world stage. It is those small places close to home. So close that really at its heart, it comes down to one person, one name. And that's something I learned from the people of Jorlo. In 2006, as genocidal violence in Sudan's Darfur region spilled into neighboring Chad, I spent several weeks with an Amnesty International research team traveling along the Chadian side of that troubled border, documenting brutal attacks against isolated villages that had left a macabre trail of death and fear. And one afternoon, we came upon the smoldering ruins of the village of Jorlo. There was no one there. The silence was eerie, broken only by our hushed voices, camera clicks as we took photos, pen scratches in our notebooks, and soft footsteps as we moved along the village's dry, craggy paths. Life had disappeared from Jorlo. No home was left intact. There were bullet casings everywhere. The remnants of ordinary life left behind were truly haunting. 2 small shoes, I can still see them, seemingly a matching pair for a very young child, hundreds of meters apart at opposite ends of the village. Twisted and blackened bed frames, metal bowls, tin buckets, clay pots, baskets, and cups and plates strewn everywhere, some dented and covered in soot, others in shards. Crops and food stores had been torched. And what appeared to have been precious water cisterns were smashed to pieces. These ruins were the signs of an attack by Darfur's murderous Janjaweed militia. There was no one left to tell us what had happened, how many had died, and how many still lived. Where had they gone? Well, 2 days later, we came upon the people of Jorlo, around 50 kilometers away. In an open field, they had taken shelter in a small grove of stunted trees. Sheets of fabric were draped in the branches to shield against the remorseless sun. We gathered under the only tree broad enough to offer some shade, and we heard the harrowing account of the attack, which had happened only 10 days earlier. And the details were truly horrific. 40 people had been killed. And I sat with a group of elders as they provided me with their names and their ages. And we soon reached 39 names. And then we stopped. There was a great deal of discussion. People reviewed the names in my notes, and I was asked to read them aloud several times. Time passed, maybe an hour, and I was finally notified that the final name had been remembered. But rather than just having the name be shouted out, I was invited to reassemble with the elders back under that same tree, and only once we were all seated did someone speak his name, and they did so reverentially. Harun Yaqub. And there was so much in that solemn moment. It was not the fact that Harun had been killed that was the point. It was not the fact that I now had the 40th name that was at the point. The point was that Harun Yaqub had lived, and had lived a life that mattered, and that he would always be cherished for that life, and that his name was being spoken to me, from me to you, and through all of us to the world, because they believed that would serve his memory. I have written Harun Yaqub's name on a piece of paper that I slip into the back of my new annual agenda every January 1st, which is then carried with me everywhere for another year. And over 20 years now, it has become a simple reminder of an essential truth. Small places, close to home. Believing that every life lived is sacred and matters deeply is the very core of universal human rights. I have thought of that so often recently. I've thought of that as the genocidal death toll has mounted daily in Gaza, now over 71,000. I thought of that in November as the world paid very little attention to news that massacres that had taken place in the Sudanese city of El Fasher were so terrible that the bloodstains could be seen in satellite images from space. I've been thinking of that as I try to imagine the thousands of protesters killed across Iran. And every time I do, I say to myself, one name, one life at a time, far beyond what the numbers convey. Believe that. In accepting and keeping the Nobel Peace Prize in 1986, there's a little dig there if you got it, Elie Wiesel was very clear. He said, we must always take sides. Neutrality helps the oppressor, never the victim. Silence encourages the tormentor, never the tormented. Sometimes we must interfere. You'll all know the very famous similar words from Martin Luther King Jr., who reminds us that in the end, we will remember not the words of our enemies, but the silence of our friends. Indeed, we must forge the world in which there is no silence, because we believe and because we stand together in solidarity with those whose rights are on the line. And in doing so, we make it absolutely clear that we are not indifferent to genocide, to a burning planet, to sexism, racism, and discrimination, to erasing trans lives, to shutting borders to refugees, to homelessness. We are certainly not indifferent to our responsibility to advance rights regarding reconciliation with Indigenous peoples, and we are not indifferent, and we will not remain silent to breaking the promise of universal human rights. Hate does not overcome hate. Denying someone's rights in response to their denial of my rights takes us precisely nowhere. We need to look for where common ground offers space to open dialogue, not to remain in silence, and from there to build understanding. Wouldn't it be magnificent if we regularly convened what I've started to call people's human rights assemblies, to bring together Indigenous peoples, civil society, human rights commissions, governments, businesses, and the public, to share perspectives, build awareness, foster greater commitment, learn from each other, learn how to talk the talk, learn how to walk the walk when it comes to universal human rights. The point is this: when we believe, when we are empowered and bound to one another in solidarity, when we spread the word and protest, when we overcome doubt by making human rights real, when we defend human rights, when we set out to make change happen, even against enormous odds, we can and we do prevail. The day before I delivered the 4th Massey Lecture in October in Happy Valley, Goose Bay, Labrador, I met Cheyenne Michel, a young Innu woman from Shahaji First Nation. She spoke movingly to me about what human rights mean to her. Her words went to the very heart of what the Universal Promise is all about. And I just want to share with you 3 of her words. For as she said, at the end of the day, isn't it all about the right to belong? That said so much to me, and it reminds me how crucial it is that we all must join in and make it clear, yes, that everyone, every single one of us does belong. We will not allow anyone to be set aside. And you know, for all of its unvarnished clarity and much needed honesty, we did not hear much concretely and convincingly from Prime Minister Carney about that, about committing ourselves to that world, a world of universal rights, a world in which everyone does belong, in his recent World Economic Forum speech. Our collective determination has advanced the universal promise of human rights in the past. In fact, there is nothing but our power, our determination, our actions that have brought change to this world. And it can, it must, and it will do so again. After all, that magnificent promise is ours. It belongs to us. The Charter of the United Nations does begin with 3 words that say it all. We, the peoples. Thank you very much, friends.
Okay, well, we would like to now open it up to questions. There are mics in each aisle. We'd like to encourage you to come forward and put your questions to Alex. Yes? We've got some. Don't be shy, everybody. Oh, there's a familiar face.
I'm just going to grab that water.
Yes. Do you want me to stay up really close?
No, I think it's okay. Yeah.
Okay. We have.
I'll just alternate back and forth.
Perfect. Thank you.
Should we start over here while you're working things out over there? Or Oh, okay.
My voice probably.
Hi, I hear you fine.
Okay, thank you so much, first of all, for the lectures. My name is Marina. I'm a second-year student from Afghanistan. I escaped Afghanistan as a refugee and came to Canada to finish my education. My questions, first of all, I have a couple of background note about the things that you said about universal and how human rights could support these universal things that we think we belongs and naturally belongs to us, could not affect to the generalizations to apply in each individual life. Because since we know the Universal Declaration of Human Rights happened based on some system, like system that after World War II, they decide to do something. And then the frustrations that in my generation, or the generation that I'm coming from the Universal Declaration of Human Rights didn't happen is a lot. Especially when it never happens, and it never, to what we speak, never happens, we are disappointed on that, and we do not believe on that. Specific for my own points, that the universal human rights never happened to some extent in certain countries. If some institution or some countries built these universal human rights, they already had a base that they worked for it since the French Revolution, and that's why it happened. But in countries like Afghanistan, you mentioned, like Iran, it never happened, and women's rights is completely denied, and I can't believe that. And my question is for you, since you work with the Human Rights Council in United Nations, do you believe that building over what we have is a correct terms? Because what we have built is not being satisfactions for anybody, specifically for third world countries. I don't like to call third world, developing countries. And do you think that United Nations and Universal Declaration of Human Rights need to change, a huge change, a change that should apply for every individual person? Because sometimes we talk about the rights of belief. Some people fight against it. Like I fight against what my country applies a belief in some other countries, but some countries like UK are trying to portray these things. Do you think in your research and the things that you talk about needs a big change about it, structurally, institutionally?
I mean, your question, I think, captures exactly the enormous challenge that we do face. And there's no question that there's many ways in which I think we all know and feel that it has become more acutely so in recent years for so many reasons. The situation in Afghanistan, a very strong example. What's happening south of the border, a reminder. The situation in Gaza, Ukraine, etc. We can't fool ourselves into thinking that all was rosy until, Donald Trump took the White House. We have had shortcomings and failures and disappointment, sometimes at grievous levels. You think of something like the genocide in Rwanda, for instance, for decades. So there is no denying the fact that the universal human rights journey has been imperfect, it has had failure, it has had shortcomings. It has also delivered justice, delivered equality, brought change, not universally. And that is the huge shortcoming, and that is why I've really identified it as what we now have to finally embrace and rise to. The United Nations, I couldn't agree with you more, is rampant and full of imperfections and peculiarities. There's so much within the United Nations human rights system that seems designed to fail to protect human rights. You start with something as blatantly obvious as the Security Council veto power, for instance, which has denied universal human rights protection over the decades to millions and millions of people because one state said your rights don't matter. I think the question you have powerfully framed for us is, do we jettison all of that and and begin anew or create something else. And there's, I think, something in that that is powerful and evocative and tempting. I think it's easy to feel called to that. Or do we need to kind of regroup, dig deeper, mobilize in different ways, and make sure that this promise that is already in front of us actually lifts off and soars? Do we get that by sitting back and waiting for things to happen at the UN Human Rights Council, a body that I have some affiliation with these days? I don't think that we do that by any means. I think, and I've kind of tried to highlight it a few times in my remarks tonight, and it probably even comes through more fully in the entirety of the Massey lectures. It's all about us. It's all about us seizing that power, exercising that power, which at the end, which from the very beginning and at the end of the day has always been our power anyway. It's been taken away from us. We've been made to believe we don't have power. We've been disempowered, and by doing so and demanding that what has already been created and established, even with its imperfections, is finally going to be respected. I think those are the important steps we take right now. Does that mean that at the same time we couldn't and shouldn't be working for bigger change, wholesale change, new approaches? Absolutely. That's what I very, very minimally started to touch on, I think, in that notion of the need to be expansive. It's not just, let's kind of retool and see what we can do with these imperfect things that are in front of us. We do need new understandings and new approaches at the same time, but it all is up to us, and not just those whose rights have been stripped away, which I think is far too often the world we live in, that we just sort of imagine that the human rights struggle is for women in Afghanistan or for the Rohingya in Myanmar or the Palestinians in Gaza, and we can sit back and observe, we can live our lives in comfort and privilege. That's what we have to kind of pull ourselves out of and ensure that no longer prevails. So,
thank you so much. The part of that you say that it's expensive, like how much do you sell, believe in it that it will possible? That's expensive is you mean commodity expensive, or you mean time-wise it's expensive to bring this change? And how much do you believe this change is possible? This much research and lectures make it possible. How much do you believe?
So when I say expansive, it is kind of, it's touching on some of the things I did briefly and all too briefly mention of sort of reimagining and re-understanding where our rights as humans fits in the natural world and what all that means in terms of human rights and the climate crisis. It means bringing human rights into areas that we've traditionally thought they have nothing to do with. Human rights in the economy, human rights in taxation, etc. Do I believe? Yes, I do believe, because at the end of the day, I see no other choice or option. Do I, in believing, somehow imagine that it's going to be an easy ride and that we can get there a week from Tuesday? Clearly not. But if we all come out of our places, not to suggest that this is a group that's sort of embedded in silence, and I'm going to be hearing that over the next little while, but we all need to ensure that we and our friends and our neighbors and our fellow students and our co-workers and anyone and everyone we have contact with is encouraged to come out of their places of silence, because it is only truly through that immense collective power that we can exercise that we will make that change happen.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Over on this side.
Thanks so much, Rebecca Sears. I work in international development. Thank you for your message tonight. I think examples that you bring, the broad spectrum of them, I was trying to think of a good word for this, but just ooze universality. The message coming out loud and clear. I'm really glad you brought up the Davos speech, because that was my question. So we have a mention of human rights as part of our values within that speech, But then all the examples you gave shows how that the government is not actually living up to that and not taking risks and not moving forward in that. I think I know the answer to this question, but how, like, where do you start in terms of, because it's obviously these movements happen through people, but they have to, the change eventually comes through governing bodies. And what advice would you give to folks who are wanting to engage at that level and wanting to bring that change?
That is the question of our time, isn't it, really? And just to pick up a little bit on the Prime Minister's words from Davos, and I could go on for an hour about it, but I won't. But I just want to pick up on a couple of things that he put at the heart of his speech, and which I very much do agree with. And that is, he said that this is a time to be pragmatic and principled. But what I think, what I fear is missing from his analysis and the way he puts that forward, but which I fundamentally believe is human rights are at the center of both sides of that coin. I think we far too often live in a world, especially those of us who care about and champion and advocate for human rights, we're the principled ones, we're the dreamers, we're the idealistic ones, and the pragmatists will kind of come back to us and say, yeah, okay, but not the whole thing, or not now, or certainly not now. I mean, look at all the enormous challenges we have in the world. How can you be talking about the need to suddenly be investing all sorts in human rights and making sure that human rights are at the forefront of how we're dealing with Donald Trump or Xi Jinping, etc. I believe that human rights is all about pragmatism as well. I don't think that human rights is just some sort of lofty, idealistic aspiration to the challenges we face in the world. I fundamentally believe that human rights are the solution. They are the way forward, and that we've never embraced that. And I think even within the human rights community, we probably haven't done a good enough job of demonstrating the ways in which, to pick up on one of the issues that I've mentioned a few times throughout my remarks, that whole challenge around national security, which was acute after 9/11, but it's acute now in our world today. That's what the whole storyline in Gaza is all about. That's what's happening to thousands of people who have been unlawfully locked up in prison camps in northeast Syria. There's so many ways in which that is still with us. And I find it so frustrating that we kind of can't inject into that conversation that human rights aren't the opposite of national security. Human rights are the very key, that if we actually truly lived in a world of abiding by the universal human rights promise, we would have the best kind of security possible. It would be universal, it would be sustainable, it would be durable. So I think we do have to, number one, we have to stand our ground, and even when there is the pushback, and there's a lot of pushback out there in the world today, some of it, may be well-meaning from kind of skeptics. Others of it, of course, ugly and hostile from haters. And I think we do need to stand our ground. I think we best stand our ground when we can do so collectively. And I think we do need to inject that vision of human rights into the discussions, whether they're in our neighborhoods or in Parliament or off at the United Nations, of human rights as solutions, human rights as concrete paths that take us out of the enormous challenges we face in the world today.
Thank you.
Okay. Over on this side.
Hi, Alex. Welcome home.
Thank you.
My name's Addy. Along with Dr. Gracie Lynn from the St. Thomas University faculty here. I'm not a member of the faculty, I'm a member of the public. Thanks for opening this up to the public. Appreciate that a lot. Had the privilege of running an organization called the Muslim Justice Center that operates a legal clinic. So we support migrant workers and people with precarious immigration status here in Brunswick. We actually have the privilege of working very closely with the Human Rights Center. We have students from the St. Thomas University Human Rights Program. Jamie was here somewhere. I thought I saw Jamie be here somewhere at some point, but really privileged to be able to have that relationship. So thank you once again to the university. The question I have for you actually is, it's been obviously a difficult few years for human rights in general, but maybe a difficult few weeks for migrant rights in particular, for those of us working on migrant rights rights here in Canada, watching Bill C-12 make its way through the House last year and now being ran through the Senate. Great for your thoughts on and reflections on C-12, its ramifications, and how you see that impact unfolding over the coming years. And related to that, if you could talk a little bit about the role of provinces in implementing the human rights promises that you have so eloquently talked about over the last hour. We run a lot into the issue of provincial leaders telling us that this is a federal responsibility, nothing for us to do here, that sort of thing. So if you could talk a little bit about that as well. Thank you.
Both very important and topical matters, Adi. Let me start with the latter. We certainly very much in Canada, but this kind of plays out around the world, that when we kind of come down to lower levels of government in countries, there is this kind of opt-out, tune-out approach that we see, that whether they're provincial governments, state governments, municipal governments, have this line of, well, the international stuff, that's our national or our federal or whatever it's called, government that goes off to the United Nations and it does its thing, and that's only about them and it has nothing to do with us. And we profoundly have, since the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was first adopted, that has been a dominant narrative in Canada's human rights discourse. In fact, some of you may or may not know that the very first vote that Canada voted, entered at the United Nations as the Universal Declaration was going through the process, and this isn't the final vote, but it was an important vote at committee level, was to abstain. A Canadian was part of the drafting group. The United States and the United Kingdom were all for it, but we abstained. And there were a whole host of reasons, but including some of it was we didn't like the human rights language. We were concerned that, freedom of movement and equality, you mean we wouldn't have been able to lock up Japanese Canadians? The right to vote, you mean status Indians get to vote? But fundamentally, even at that stage, the challenges of federalism were put on the table, and the federal government was making it very clear. If we do this, it's going to be tricky. The provinces, they control things when it comes to education and healthcare. Don't know that we're really up to the task. Maybe we should sit this out. Now, we did get our act together a few weeks later when the final vote came along. I think we were probably shamed by the fact that amongst our allies, we were really the only outlier. But 78 years later, that still is what plagues us, haunts us when it comes to really ensuring that we're doing our part of making sure that the universal human rights promise is actually implemented consistently everywhere in this country, regardless of which province you live in, regardless of which territory you live in, regardless of whether it's a matter that is in federal constitutional jurisdiction or provincial jurisdiction. Because at the end of the day, international law is very clear in this. The United Nations is very clear on this. It's not that the federal government has gone off and signed off on all of these treaties. Canada has, the country, the nation of Canada. And we cannot accept any excuses from any level of government for a failure to come together and in a coordinated, effective way, universally deliver the promise consistently across the country. And so maybe a takeaway I would urge upon all of you is, and I think an important part of your question, Adi, is I think we do give provinces too easy a ride here. I don't think provinces hear enough from us. That's a kind of common theme I'm coming back to. Use our voice. What's our power? What are we saying? What are we doing? Well, we need to be more assertively and consistently saying to our provincial governments, calling them out on their failures. Provincial governments are the ones who should be leading the way in ensuring that the internationally protected right to adequate housing, for instance, the internationally protected rights to education, which is supposed to mean progressively moving towards free post-secondary education, how's that working? That they're really hearing from us about our rights and our expectations that our governments at all levels are living up to those obligations. C-12 and the state of respect and regard for the rights of refugees and migrants, yes, in Canada, but I think you were kind of positioning that question in the global context. There's no question that this is, I think, one of the most troubling challenges we face in universal human rights right now, and it's not new. We've kind of always lived in a world which has assumed that the first and easiest to be kind of kicked out of my lifeboat that I kept talking about, or Mohammed Salim's lifeboat, are the ones who aren't citizens. They aren't, because they aren't really us. We don't need to worry so much about them. Their rights can be easily taken away. And we've seen that at various times in the past, and we're obviously seeing that in a very big way right now. I think many of us are feeling very troubled and concerned that we've seen Canada very much start to move into that laneway, not to pretend that we have always had some sort of altruistically perfect approach to the rights of refugees and migrants, clearly not, but that we are in so many blatant and deliberate ways now kind of not hiding the fact that we're willing to demonstrate disdain for the notion that the rights of refugees and migrants need to be universally protected. There is hope in some corners of the world. Some people may have followed the amazing thing. The number of times I've been talking about great things happening in Spain recently, and I'm sure you're aware of this, but the Spanish government has taken this amazing step of regularizing the status and thus protecting the rights of 500,000 or something undocumented migrants. Spain doesn't face any lesser challenges around economic growth and national demographics than Canada does. So what Spain can do, we can do. And so, again, the government needs to hear from us. There is, as you would well know, there is mobilizing and activism happening around this, but it's not enough. It's not punching through. We're not hearing these concerns, on the front page of the Globe and Mail every day. So we need to talk it up. We need to make sure that our friends and our coworkers and our colleagues truly understand what's at stake here. And we don't have a lot of time with respect to C-12, and we may or may not carry the day with respect to C-12, but that will not mean that the struggle is over. And I think that if we continue to amplify the voices, bring more to the table, we can prevail. I think we're over to this side.
Thank you very much for the instructive lecture. My name is Eddie. I'm a third-year law student at UNB. And I guess my question was, you brought up action plans around human rights a handful of times. And I see that in parallels to the TRC calls to action as an action plan that we currently have. So the question I have towards you is, how do we evaluate participation in these action plans if there's one created around human rights, and or how do we look at evaluating the current TRC action plan around reconciliation?
Well, so it kind of is this easy throwaway. We've got a problem, let's have an action plan. We've got a problem, let's have a strategy. We've got a problem, let's have a policy. And I think, obviously, we sell ourselves short, and it would be dangerous if we just somehow assume, we wanted one, now we've got a national action plan, things are good. And I think the TRC and also the plan developed under the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act is a clear reminder to us of that. Number one, the development of any action plan needs a very good process. It needs to be obviously inclusive and consultative, and I think we've got sort of better and worse examples of that in Canada across a whole range of issues, but it has to start there. The action plan has to be meaningful. I think an action plan that is just performative and lofty, which is a pretty easy thing to draft and commit to, is at the end of the day meaningless. And for me, thinking of an international human rights action plan, I want something with specifics. I want things with sort of concrete markers and clear examples that make it something that can actually, number one, meaningfully be used, but then secondly, and I think this probably goes to the heart of what your question is all about, meaningfully be evaluated. And if we don't do that, if we don't have a thoughtful, meaningful, public way of ensuring that we are having that kind of evaluation and that there is some accountability linked with that, then even if it is kind of a sufficiently detailed and concrete action plan, I don't think it's going to deliver the goods in the end. There are examples of international human rights action plans that many other governments around the world have adopted. There's a number that have been developed in Scandinavia that are thought of as good practice. Within the United Kingdom, not the UK as a whole, but Scotland has a really interesting and very detailed international human rights action plan. So it's not something around which we would have to necessarily reinvent the wheel. We would need to make it relevant and meaningful in a Canadian context.
Yeah, thank you. I really appreciate the earlier sentiment around one person being able to be an advocate or a vehicle for change, and then these instruments really providing that vision to what that change might be. But thank you for your answer.
All right, absolutely. One person.
Hi, I'm Sean Brown. I'm a professor of political science here at St. Thomas. I like and I admire a great deal of what you're saying. At the same time, as a political scientist, I don't think people are that good.
Sorry, that people are what?
Are that good. They're not as good as we want them to be. They're not as good as we need them to be. You're preaching to the converted in many ways in this room. But the fact is, today, a couple of days ago, Marco Rubio gave a speech in Munich where he lamented the downfall of the imperial world order, the European colonies, and said essentially we need a return to that. Donald Trump and a lot of people around the world get by on tribalism and hatred and stirring up all the things that are opposed to what you've said. And they're ascendant at the moment. And go on with that. I don't want to just dump cold water and said by any means. But I think your logic is impeccable. It's just that a lot of people don't actually believe in your logic for their own selfish reasons. Humans are tribalistic, very often. They're racist. Religion divides us. So these are all the things we need to overcome. I don't think either it's coincidental. I think that in most of the countries in the world where human rights have been successfully attained at some level, they were rich. You mentioned China earlier. My students know I'm actually quite gung-ho on China. But I don't ignore the fact China has human rights problems. On the other hand, the Chinese argue that they lifted 800 million people out of poverty over a 30-year period. And from a human rights perspective, that's an incredible achievement. And so it's more complicated. So let me ask two questions to you. One, you put a lot of stock in the idea that democracy can do these things, can work. Do we actually live in a democracy? The United States is clearly not a democracy. It probably never was, but whatever it is, it's failing state. Are we that different? We have people who are capitalists. A lot of what you want requires a redistribution of wealth. Those are the people who are going to say, you take my money away from me, I'm going to take my money and leave. So you've got that problem. Can democracy actually deal with these issues? Second question is, a lot of people around the world look at the Western world and say, we use human rights as a club to beat them, but hypocrisy, in fact, is what defines the Western world. And after Gaza, I don't see how anyone can argue that. I was reading an article today that said, even now, Canada has a regular pipeline of ammunition making it to Israel. So people around the world look at us and they say, sure, we talk a lot about human rights. You pull out whenever you want to beat us up. But it means nothing to you. It clearly means nothing to you. It's been nothing but a rhetorical device. And I think they're right. So how do you respond to that? Because you clearly are a true believer. You're absolutely, as I said, your logic is impeccable. But when you go around the world and you have people saying this to you, presumably leaders of states as opposed to people who are actually victims. How do you respond to that?
Well, first and foremost, I don't disagree with a single thing you've said. And I think a lot of my comments have picked up on exactly some of the things you've highlighted about the double standards and the hypocrisy, the fact that we have created human rights as an exclusive club that is largely Western and male and moneyed, etc., that there have been immense colossal failures, that absolutely the Donald Trumps in the world today are a huge barrier to universal human rights protection. But we've had Donald Trump light, Donald Trump-like in many manifestations over the years and decades. I don't want to suggest for a moment that I'm somehow naive to all of that. I've witnessed it. I've sat with people who have been at the front lines of all of the struggles and the crises and the shortcomings and the disappointment that you're talking about. And I think we all need to embrace and acknowledge that, because that is our starting point. That's where if we're going to move anywhere to a better place, if we're going to have any kind of transformation, we have to be honest and aware of all of that. Absolutely. Do I, therefore, I just kind of thinking of your opening words that, that people are not good, or not enough people are good. One of the things that has been really, perhaps one of the most meaningful things for me about this whole experience of delivering the Massey lectures, and then in addition to that, dozens now, I think, of Massey kind of spin-offs and side events like us gathering here, literally in every corner of the country, and not just in, sort of downtown Toronto with a reliably progressive left-leaning crowd that shows up in tiny little mining communities in Labrador and in far-flung corners of northeastern BC and in the Bible Belt of southern British Columbia. And everywhere, the audiences that have shown up are wanting to engage in this conversation. And it's given me a sense of hope, a little spark of hope, that because things are so fraught, are so upside down, and in some respects seem so unbelievably dystopic, there are people from unexpected corners are kind of waking up and engaging in the conversation in ways that I've certainly never sensed or experienced in my decades of human rights activism. Now, I don't want to overstate that. I'm not suddenly trying to suggest to you that there's this amazing current that is out there in Canada and we just need to ride it. I think I've seen glimmers of it in very unexpected corners. And I think what I would want to say to us is this is our moment to kind of blow, breathe into that. Make sure those sparks do start to blaze, and that's that small places close to home piece of we're not going to turn things around at the White House anytime soon, but we can start to have those conversations with those who are close to us about the human rights concerns that are directly impacting our communities, but also making the connections and understanding Canada to Gaza. What does that mean? I think there's a moment, but I think we'll only rise to that moment if we really embrace it. Okay. Over there.
Hi there. My name is Alexander Stonehouse. I'm a human rights and philosophy student here at STU. And this is kind of a personal interest of mine, but in thinking about freedom of expression and freedom of association and the limits which are prescribed to those, and then thinking of that in contrast with things like the rising wave of neo-Nazism and supremacist ideas in Ontario and in the West, in Canada, I would think that these, it's true, objectively, these ideological rises are affecting the realization of human rights, and they're counterintuitive to the furtherance of human dignity, which are the principles that human rights swear to. And so, do you think that the fact that these ideologies are allowed to brew, even considering what Canada has ratified, and the fact that there's a lack of strict enforcement, even on the small local scale, not even necessarily with large governing powerful bodies that have resistance, even among within communities, between people. Do you think that this gives weight to claims that human rights ideologies are idealistic? And my question is, how could a system which allows for the reblossoming of such hateful ideals and in a way supports them through allowing things like peaceful demonstrations of white supremacy, do you think how could a system like that truly uphold the universal principles that human rights are based on?
Oh, you framed one of the easiest debates we have in the human rights world. But it is. It's a fundamental one. I guess there's 2 or 3 things that come to mind. Number one, yes, freedom of expression is hard. And I have my own struggles around it all the time. I am a strong believer, and I do agree that we restrict, or unjustifiably restrict and limit freedom of expression to our collective peril. And that is an important starting point, but it does set us up for some difficult situations. That's number one. Number two, we do have to acknowledge and recognize that freedom of expression is one of those rights within the universal human rights framework that is not drafted in absolute terms. There are many rights that are. There's never any exception to the protection against torture, for instance. There's no circumstances ever, no matter how grave a crisis a country faces, that ever justifies torturing someone. Freedom of expression, in the very elaboration of how the right is drafted in international treaties, recognizes that there's an interplay between a variety of circumstances. And for me, the most interesting and challenging one is that it is absolutely recognized that we may need to have some limitations around rights when the rights of others are at stake. Now, that's a complicated dance that I don't think we will ever have. And I'm not trying to suggest that you've kind of posed the question assuming and hoping there's an easy answer to that, and I can sense that there isn't an easy answer to that. But we have to engage in that dance. And I'll use an example of a situation where I think we had a colossal failure to do so here in Canada. I live in Ottawa. I live in downtown Ottawa. Some of you may know that we had a situation in downtown Ottawa in 2022 when the trucks came to town. And essentially the people of downtown Ottawa, I'm one neighborhood away from ground zero, but people who live in those central neighborhoods were terrorized, were essentially being held hostage in their homes, were being assaulted in the streets, were being subjected to hate just because they wore masks or because they were a person with disability or a whole host of other reasons. And did police show up? Police that in many other circumstances are more too willing to shut down a Black Lives Matter protest or a land back protest, and suddenly they were saying, freedom of expression matters. For a while we had a police chief who was trying to tell us that even trucks had the right to free expression, and that they were not prepared to intervene in any way because it might provoke, who knows where it might lead, etc. I had the great honor of serving on a People's Commission that in the aftermath of all of that, for a year, held community hearings. We heard from over 200 people who were living that reality. And at the end of the day, the obvious, but a real kind of profound indictment, I think, for us was that governments had completely failed to embrace the fact that there is that other component to freedom of expression, that the rights of others matter. And that doesn't mean that we casually allow the rights of others to strip away something so important as the right to freedom of expression. But when we've reached that scale, when there is essentially a violent, abusive occupation of neighborhoods that is completely taking away people's rights, we have crossed that line. And so one of the key recommendations we made, not that it's necessarily going anywhere, but we had an interesting exchange in the aftermath for a while with the Ottawa Police Service, is we need, whether it's police services, governments, to more meaningfully grapple with that, and I don't know if it is the right metaphor, but I'll call it a dance, that really understands the intricate way in which freedom of expression and people's rights to equality and safety and dignity fit together. Not that we see them as opposing goals, but that what we're really working towards is an approach that is going to, as best we can, ensure that we're having a win-win. The last thing, I think I already said last once, but I'll say last again, is we do have laws. We do have hate laws in this country. And they're there for exactly that reason, that it's recognized that that's probably one of the most acute examples of when freedom of expression does, in very clear and direct ways, impinge upon the rights of others. Those are tough prosecutions. The evidence is tough. The public debate that it provokes can be quite contentious and difficult. But I would suggest that one of the ways in which we perhaps more meaningfully start to ensure that that's being taken seriously is that we start to normalize that conversation as well. We need to deepen our own understanding of what is hate, to the extent that it should limit someone's freedom of expression. I think we all kind of come to that debate maybe with kind of maybe a bit of common sense ideas, maybe a bit of a guttural approach, but I think we need to really kind of deepen our understanding of that if we're going to make sure that that tension gets resolved in ways that hopefully at the end of the day are in all of our interests.
Thank you. So just so it wouldn't in fact be that there is a deep incoherence within human rights ideology as a whole, but rather it's just a matter of practice and
I would say it is a bit more profound than, yes, practice, but I think it is understanding, as really kind of understanding how the entirety of what human rights is all about fits together. There was a very, very important global world conference on human rights back in 1993. In fact, the last time that we had a world in which it was possible to bring all governments together and spend days really debating and developing and committing themselves to human rights understanding. And one of the really simple but profound things that came out of that, and this was governments committing to this, not me, was to recognize that all human rights are interrelated, interdependent, and indivisible. And I think that's something we do need to hold on to and really understand, that we shouldn't be thinking about, freedom of expression over here, equality over here, that we really need to embrace and understand how it all fits together.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
Thanks, Alex.
I think there's something about to happen.
Yeah, something about to happen. This is a really terrific discussion. I wish we had more time. We are now significantly over time, so I think we will just take one final question from this side, from this person who has been waiting patiently.
I'd be willing to take them
minutes.
both and answer.
Oh, okay, so if the two of you can put your questions quickly, Alex's...
I'll do a joint answer to two questions.
Will that resolve it? Okay, perfect. Thank you so much, Alex.
Thanks. I'm Dave Kochie, reporter for the Indigenous Media Co-op. My question is about Cuba. Some critics of Canadian foreign policy, especially on the socialist left in Canada, Northern Rio, for example, have called on Canada to ship oil to Cuba in defiance of the intensified American embargo. What are your thoughts on this, and more generally the crisis in Cuba, and what Canada or Canadians can do with that?
Okay. And the other question?
My question has nothing to do with that.
I'll find a link.
There's a really interesting tension at the heart of, I think, your talk and some of the questions that have come up, which is the tension between a firm belief in human rights, the fact that they're important, and that our world will be better if we fight for them to be applied universally, and a deep frustration and loss of trust in the institutions that have been meant to ensure that that happens. And so, because you talked about the importance of us kind of really pushing for those ourselves and taking back our power, I'm wondering what you see is the role of communities and more grassroots organizers. I'm thinking of specifically the autonomous organizing that's going on in Minneapolis and Minnesota against ICE there. And if you think, I'm wondering what you've seen of that kind of organizing in your time working for human rights.
Right. Two great questions. So Cuba, yes, Canada needs to kind of step up and play a role here. You know, there was a point where we like to think of ourselves as the country that was prepared to kind of go it alone and be a leader in sort of recognizing and engaging with Cuba. We've kind of left that way behind us, and obviously there's many other governments. You know, I think of our CUSMA partners in Mexico who have been saying and indicating that, although they're kind of a little scared now with what Donald Trump has been doing in response, but at least have been demonstrating some willingness to both kind of stand with the Cuban people, but I would say to stand up for human rights, because this isn't. I think this is another one of those areas where we kind of think about, oh, this is about oil. Okay, well, I'm interested in human rights. That's not human rights, is it? But of course, everything that is incumbent upon ensuring that there are the kind of fuel supplies that are necessary in Cuba is essential to almost every human right imaginable on that island, right? And I think it is very, very disappointing that Canada not only hasn't kind of stepped up with some meaningful action in response, but I might have missed it, but we haven't even heard any expressions of concern for a country that we have such a connection with, that I don't know what the numbers are, but probably second only to Mexico in terms of the sun destination that other than the United States, that Canadians go to. There's so many Canadians there who have meaningful, close relationships with the country. Like, we should be engaged, and I think our politicians need to hear that from us. Absolutely, communities and grassroots couldn't be more fundamental to what I'm, I guess, calling on all of us to do, that sense of seizing our power, becoming engaged, not being silent. I think the most profoundly powerful place to look to as we seize our power and come out of our places of silence is exactly those grassroots, community organizing examples that we're seeing everywhere, and all respect in the world to the people of Minneapolis, who I think have shown us what that can look like. That it is even when it's not my rights that are on the line, I'm showing up because I do fundamentally understand and believe that rights belong to all of us, and therefore if I don't step up and show my solidarity with those who are most endangered right now, then I've lost my way, and the courage and the conviction and obviously the great losses that the people of Minneapolis have experienced are, I think, an example to all of us. So thank you for kind of letting us remember the people of Minneapolis as we wrap up tonight.
A terrific last point to end on, and I'm hoping that you will all join us in the lobby for refreshments. You better grab them before the catering service takes them away. Then make sure, please, to buy a copy of Alex's book, Universal, and get the man himself to sign it for you. Thank you so much, everybody, for coming. Thank you very much, Alex, for a wonderful...
Thank you. And thank you.